In this last section, really, the main thing that we want to talk about is this figure 13.10 from your textbook, which explains the carbon cycle. So we've talked about the effects of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas. It lets sunlight in. It doesn't let Earth light out. Therefore, it's a blanket. It warms the planet. It traps energy in the planet, and this affects the climate. That's the basic process of climate change is really quite simple. In the details, it's more complicated though, because uh, the system of the Earth is more complicated than just fossil fuels and the atmosphere with CO2 in it. Carbon is a very important and very common element. And so this figure illustrates the cycle of carbon between the Earth and the atmosphere through various processes. So all we're going to talk about in this video is understanding this figure. This is similar to some of the other styles of figures that we've seen in the book where there are flows of energy, for example. So we've got one that's very important about the flow of energy uh, from the sun into the atmosphere and from the earth through the atmosphere and back out. This one is now flow of carbon. So the values in this uh, figure, the numbers in each box and next to each arrow are in gigatons. If they're in a box, that's a billion tons. That means it's a trillion kilograms. And next to the arrows, it's gigatons per year of carbon. Now, you're going to see some numbers here that you're like, wait a minute, I thought the number was something else, because sometimes we've talked about how much carbon dioxide there is. Carbon dioxide, of course, is carbon and oxygen. So there's different, the mass of carbon dioxide is different than the mass of carbon. This figure's all just values of carbon. So, and it's in mass, not in percentages. So that's a difference. So let's just look at the top, atmosphere. In 1750, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the atmosphere had 590 gigatons of carbon suspended in it in the form almost entirely of carbon dioxide. In 2016, that number was 850. These are the numbers that correspond to the 270 or 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide prior to the Industrial Revolution. That's the 590 number. And the current value of about 410 to 415 parts per million of carbon dioxide, that corresponds to the 850 number. You take the ratio of those two numbers, and you'll see that the 850 over 590 is like the 400 over 280. So it's just different units, but it's the same effect. So that's the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere overall. And you'll see that all these arrows show that burning fossil fuels is not the only way that carbon goes into the atmosphere. So on the far left of the figure, we see the fossil fuel reserves. That represents not the resource, but the reserves that we know about that we can make use of at the current time of fossil fuels is 2,000 gigatons of carbon buried underground, and we're burning that stuff. It took hundreds of millions of years, as we've described, for life to create that 2,000 gigatons of fossil fuels. Now we're burning it, and at the present rate, we're putting 10 to 11 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere each year. That's the arrow 10 on the left, going from fossil fuel reserves up into the atmosphere. That's our anthropogenic, human-caused input. That is a forcing. That is a perturbation that is happening in the recent history of the planet. And of course, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, that number 10 was much smaller, less than 1, and it has increased dramatically as we've seen with the growth of the population, the growth of our energy intensity. So even 100 years ago, that number would have been less than 5. So there's 10 gigatons per year going in from our burning of fossil fuels. But now let's take a look at some of the other arrows. Plants pull carbon out of the atmosphere because they breathe in carbon dioxide. They take the carbon to make new plant cells, and they exhale oxygen. So photosynthesis is the process of plants using energy from the sun to do chemical reactions with CO2 that they breathe in from the atmosphere. That removes 123 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere every year into plants. All the plants on the surface of the planet represent a reservoir of 550 gigatons. Well, the animals, you and I, and all the others, we breathe in oxygen, do chemical reactions, and we exhale carbon dioxide. That's respiration, and that's the 62 gigatons going back into the atmosphere from animal respiration. When those plants and animals die, uh, that leads to, in the surface layers, a significant reservoir of carbon. That's the soil detritus box that is the same size as the fossil fuel reserve box. But some of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. If it's on the surface and it decays, and microbes process that dead plant and animal life and exhale it back into the atmosphere. Fires and deforestation put combined 57 plus 1 or 58 gigatons per year back into the atmosphere. So that takes care of these cycles on the left. Some carbon gets carried into the ocean with rivers. That's the runoff arrow. And then our last two arrows between the sort of planet, the surface, and the atmosphere are on the right, the air-water exchange. The ocean is sort of like a carbonated drink. CO2 dissolves in water, and the numbers there, 78 and 80, represent the current rates of exchange of CO2 between the ocean and the atmosphere. So each year, CO2 bubbles out of the ocean into the atmosphere and is absorbed into the ocean. And that's a cycle, and it has to do with the temperature. If it's warmer, just as your soda, or my soda at least, if it's warm, it gets flat. That's because the CO2 evaporates out of the soft drink. If it's cold, the CO2 stays in it and it's more bubbly, right? So the ocean is the same way. Warmer temperatures, you'll have CO2 evaporating out of the ocean. Cooler temperatures, it will stay in and CO2 will be absorbed into the ocean. And then you see on the far right in the oceans, you have the various quantities of carbon that are tied up in life in the ocean and dissolved in the water in the ocean, and then the relative cycling of carbon between the deep ocean and the surface layers of the ocean. So all of this added up is the overall carbon cycle. So it's not just as simple as we burn CO2, it goes into the atmosphere, and that's the end of the story. We put more CO2 into the atmosphere, that can affect the rates of some of these other arrows. So if we put more CO2 in, maybe this down arrow on the right that has 80 gigatons of carbon dioxide going to the atmosphere increases because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, more gets absorbed in the ocean. Thing is, we can measure all these numbers, and of course, you can see in that upper box in the atmosphere, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is actually increasing. And that means that the down arrows have not increased as quickly as our up arrow of this extra 10 has increased. And when you add it all up, while we're putting 10 gigatons per year extra carbon into the atmosphere, the net rate of increase currently is about 5 gigatons per year. That means that helps explain why the rate of climate change has been accelerating. 150 years ago, we were maybe only putting 1 or 2 gigatons, if that, of carbon into the atmosphere, and the Earth system may have been able to adjust to that and say, oh, I can handle an extra gigaton per year of carbon. I'll just increase my rate of acidification of the ocean and put that extra carbon into the ocean. Now that we're putting 10 in, the planet seems to be saying, 10, hey, I can take 5 and deal with it, and it's pumping that 5 down into some of these other downward arrows, but the extra 5 is piling up in the atmosphere. And of course, there are consequences for the increases in those other arrows. The main downward arrow that can increase is this 80 on the far right. Can't do much about the photosynthesis arrow unless we plant lots and lots and lots of forests. With that downward arrow, if we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, we can increase that downward arrow into the ocean. But then I'm putting carbon dioxide into the ocean and I'm making it more acidic. I'm turning the ocean into a more bubbly soft drink, and that has consequences as well for uh, coral reefs and ocean fauna. So that's our uh, important summary of the carbon cycle in this module. You can look through the other slides and look at the links that have been posted in this part, which take you to some other resources where you can see the evolution of carbon in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases as well.